welcome everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm actually very, very happy in retrospect about the invitation. It was kind of random and short term, but I'm happy that I made it work. Yeah, it's been very interesting to see like the previous two talks and sort of all the very similar questions that I faced at various points, but like sort of from a different perspective. So yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, today I'm here to talk a little bit about my experience doing design at the GNOME project. A few words sort of about myself. Yeah, as already said, I'm a designer, and I think through that, I've sort of often slipped into a bit of a community organizer role, because like, if you're a designer in a self-organized project, sort of like, someone needs to do that work, and if you actually want stuff to happen, you kind of end up doing that. I've been doing GNOME stuff since around 2016. I've worked on a number of things since then. For a while, I was working for Purism on mobile stuff. We did libadwaita and like all of the sort of mobile platform things. Most recently, I've co-organized a project with the Sovereign Tech Fund, sort of both on the organizing side and also a little bit design stuff. And yeah, that's me. And I want to start this talk with a talk that I gave in 2017. Yeah, I looked slightly different back then. So I gave a talk in 2017 at this free software conference in Italy, sort of trying to bring the good word of design to all these nice hackers. And sort of, I think my basic point was that without design, free software is just for nerds and like companies to sort of take away people's freedoms rather than giving people freedoms. And if you actually want like emancipatory software, you really need to sort of have structures that are able to take the needs of people who are not hackers into account, and sort of, yeah, all the classic stuff. Like, I don't think I need to explain this here. And sort of the thing I tried to sell to people at the time was like, we should do design-driven free software, which is, like gives people freedoms, but like really in a way that is sort of actually useful to more than just like whatever, a few thousand hackers. And sort of at the time I had done like a little bit of research on like how various projects got to that state. And these are sort of the approaches that I observed in practice. It's like either designers kind of joining from the outside, or developers from on the inside, sort of like getting into design and sort of changing the culture that way. Or often what happens, and I think what also happened with GNOME in some ways in the early 2000s, is that like a project like it's really in a bad state and like a company needs it to work. They get involved, they like pay some people both to do design and also to implement it, and sort of kickstarts that culture. Or I think another approach that's also been often successful in practice, although I think too rare, is you just start a new project with some designers on the founding team, and then it sort of like has that DNA from the start. I think Elementary is like sort of a classic example. And I thought for this talk it would be interesting, like as a general frame, to look a little bit at like sort of where are we 8 years later, like sort of how have various projects sort of progressed, I guess. And I think for me the biggest sort of thing that has changed in the meantime is basically that like the app ecosystem of like small to medium-sized third-party apps, especially around GNOME, but I think also some other ecosystems, has exploded. Like we've seen literally hundreds of new projects in those last 8 years of like very well-designed, very high-quality apps maintained by like sort of completely independent teams and groups generally, but like sort of following, for example, like upstream HIG from GNOME, like benefiting from the design work done elsewhere. So I think that at a structural level is like, I think maybe the biggest thing has changed. But then looking at some other existing software, I think the story is a little bit less ideal. I looked at Thunderbird the other week, and like I think it's an example of someone who like put in a lot of effort and like I think has done some really good work organizing, both like on the fundraising side and like sort of on bringing in new people, like improving their structures, at least from the outside. I don't know, but then like you look at it in practice, and there's still like a lot of really messy stuff. Like there's still 2 tab bars. Like for every widget, like you can see like 3 different implementations of it. I mean, often like the nature of the beast is like that software is really complicated. It's been there for a very long time. It's hard to change, even with like sort of ideal conditions. And then you look at projects with like less ideal conditions. I think LibreOffice being the classic one. They still have this dialogue where like you can choose between 7 sort of like different main UIs. And they all still exist. This has not really changed in the last 8 years. They're all like slightly half-baked, at least in sort of, I don't know. Yeah. It's always tricky because, and the funny thing is, like the talk that I gave in 2017, I had already made this exact point, and there was someone from LibreOffice there, and we talked a little bit about it. And I think like 8 years later, nothing has changed. But I think like yeah, there's different levels to which software has changed. Inkscape, I'm actually very happy that Martin was mentioning earlier that you're like starting to work with them a little bit. I think they've improved a little bit in the last 8 years. They've fixed definitely a bunch of stuff, but then sometimes they add new features that look like this. Like this is the tool to like round a path. And like it's useful. Like I use it all the time. Like if you want to non-destructively like round a path, but like it has this settings dialog which I do not understand, and I use it all the time. So, so yeah, a mixed bag, I would say. But I think like something I've come to realize, like after whatever, looking at a number of projects and so like trying to get involved in places, is like a lot of projects just are not really like structurally set up to work in a design first way, and actually like getting there is significantly harder than I think I maybe naively thought at the time. Like you don't just like go tell people like, oh, do design first, and then just sort of happens. Like even if you like lay out pathways, like there's a lot of really difficult additional factors. Because I think like there's just like the material reality that you're sort of often talking about, like how people spend their free time, and it's I think very difficult to tell people like how to do that. The cultural like sort of affinity to design like sort of needs to at least a little bit be there. Otherwise, you're like always going to be fighting a very uphill battle. I think as the previous talks have already sort of explained in more detail. I think often another problem is that like the stuff that people want to work on is important, right? Like they need to clean up a lot of technical debt. They like are working with very few resources, so they don't really care about the UI in the first place. There's just like sort of a really it's actually getting that kind of thing started for a designer coming in, or like for someone even who is already in the project, like sort of getting a big sort of cultural change like that going is very difficult, especially with no resources. And I think that the cycle is sort of like you have a bad design, someone tries to join, it's like too hard, they like are like, okay, maybe I'll go somewhere else where it's easier, and then the people who are left are still the same ones, and then sort of nothing really changes. But what does also happen is that then those people go to the places where it does work. And then you have like sort of this, right, like looking at the 5 examples from before, you have this sort of like rich get richer situation where like some projects or some areas where stuff works, like everyone just kind of accumulates there because that is where you get stuff done. And then the other projects are, yeah, as we saw, like still the same as 8 years ago. And so I thought like maybe for today, like one helpful input here to the discussion, although I don't know how scalable to other situations, is like what does a culture look like where it kind of does work? Because I think we have sort of seen this accumulation effect around the GNOME project a little bit in the last 8 years. And yeah, that was sort of my general frame for this part of the talk. So I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the GNOME project, but just in case someone isn't, for context, like it is a desktop environment. So basically, like most of the like visible parts of an operating system. This is a screenshot of one of the more recent versions. The project is like very large and like has a lot of different parts to it. I think at the core of it, it is a community of like a few hundred people like who work in a self-organized way. Some of them are volunteers, some of them are full-time. Many are like sort of a mix of both. It's yeah, as I said, like sort of a complete independent operating system stack that has everything from the toolkit to like make the apps, to like the low-level things that you need to like do input stuff, to a compositor, like a shell, like all of the things that you need. And then there's a pretty large app ecosystem around that of like the core apps that come with the system, circle apps that are sort of like the whatever verified third-party apps, and then just like other third-party apps that are around that. And I think another part that's important like is that GNOME developers tend to intervene sort of across the stack if something is needed elsewhere to unblock something we need. And so there's like a lot of connections to other adjacent projects that are part of that stack. Our design structure is currently around 5 to 10 people, depending on how you count. Also a mix of like full-time and volunteers. We do everything from like the operating system to the apps to the websites, the icons, like everything. And it's sort of like recognized to be our responsibility, and like, yeah, I think we're well integrated in all of the processes that are needed to like whatever make changes in the project, sort of like plan initiatives, stuff like that. And I think another important part is that's a relatively stable group over time. I think since 2017 or so, like 4 people have sort of remained stable for that entire time. A bunch of people like have joined recently and sort of I think are sort of getting into that more stable sort of I don't know long-term contributor position. And so I think it's a healthy group from that point of view. It's very difficult to sort of explain the way the various groups inside the project sort of like interact with each other, but I gave it a try. So basically, like at the core of everything are the modules, like the individual software repositories, right? Like the compositor, the shell, the apps, like all of those are modules, and they have maintainers. Could be 1 or multiple people who like make the releases. They like do the care work around like the repository, reviewing stuff, triaging issues, stuff like that. And then you have like other people in the project or from outside who like contribute to those. And then you have sort of like project-wide structures that that coordinate specific areas. For example, you have the internationalization team that like does obviously internationalization, and then there are like individual language teams under that. There's a release team that takes care of like, yeah, making releases twice a year, whatever, making sure that like the freezes are being respected, making sure that the dependencies build and stuff like this. And then the design team does this for all the user-facing parts of the project. And so anything in the project that like affects the user experience in some way, like the design team is involved with, and sort of like everyone understands that to be the case. So like if someone wants to make a change there, like they ask the design team or ping us on GitLab or whatever. And like generally it is assumed that like if a larger sort of user affecting initiative happens, sort of they like the design team is involved from the start, I guess. A little bit about how we work. Sort of I think generally we don't like do a ton of like fancy whatever tooling stuff. I think we basically draw mockups in Inkscape and then like sort of discuss them. But there are also people who like whatever draw their mockups on paper or like use Penpot or Figma or whatever else. We don't super care about that because to us like designs are like an artifact of the discussion. And those discussions are the important part. So like that's usually like in a GitLab issue or in Matrix or like on a design call. And sort of generally the way stuff works is like we have the mockup like repositories on GitLab as an archive more than anything. And that is sort of like our way of working here also because we don't really have enough designers to like actually keep mockups up to date or something. It is always like an artifact of a discussion. And then I think generally another important part is that like we're very well integrated in the development process. So like when something is being developed, like as a designer, like I built the latest version of the merge request, I give feedback, like yeah, it's reviews like anything else. I think another very important part to like sort of why design works the way it works within GNOME is just the general project culture, even independently of design. I think we have a very strong upstream first ethos, which is sort of the idea that like if you see a problem somewhere, you don't like work around it for yourself. You look at like what is the root of the problem, and then you go there and then you fix it. You get involved in other projects if needed, right? Like that's the sort of interventionism that I mentioned earlier. And there's really like a strong dislike of hacks and sort of short-term fixes, and like always the idea of like, okay, but how should this actually work, sort of in the long run? I think something that we inherited from like the very early part of the project when everything was sort of, yeah, like a lot of independent modules that you could sort of like build your own desktop environment and like everything's really messy. A bunch of like user researchers came in and were like, there's 5 clocks here, like what the fuck, no one understands this. And sort of there's like this famous blog post called Choosing Our Preferences from like 2002 that we still link to like every week, which sort of like, I think just, yeah, like presents this idea that like, if you like add a bunch of preferences, that's a trade-off. Like you're sort of creating that for yourself down the line. It's much better to fix the underlying defaults. Right, we all know this. I don't think I need to go into more detail here. And then, yeah, like design first, in the sense that like if something is supposed to happen that affects the user experience, designers are involved from the start. And it's not just like, oh, how does it look? Like, how does it work? No, it's like, should we do this in the first place? And I think that is sort of like a pretty, I don't know, like core thing that maybe sort of distinguishes us from other free software projects. And I think more generally there is like a culture of like deferring to the expert. I think this is an idea that I picked up from elementary like many years ago. Sort of that like in a discussion, it's generally really helpful to like sort of look at like who are the people who like are the experts in this particular area, and like is it my place to like whatever be annoying about this, or like is it better to like find consensus based on okay these are the people who like whatever have worked on this for way longer. And I think especially that sort of especially helps like bridge that problem that was mentioned earlier, right? That were like developers like don't trust designers. I think we do have that trust, and I think on that level it really like improves collaboration. I think another part that's important about GNOME is that it's like not itself a product with customers and so on, and like there isn't a single group that controls it. There are like a bunch of companies that are involved. There are obviously like a lot of volunteers. But like GNOME is sort of like this ethereal thing like in the middle between like Red Hat and Endless and Canonical and so on. And I think that really sort of like allows us to be a bit more opinionated, be a bit more like user focused than like you would have to be maybe like if whatever you had customers. And I think like it also sort of like this like diffuse power situation creates a situation where like people like move between companies, but really what the thing they care about is the upstream project. And so like the employer that you have right now is not the one that you might have forever, but this project never goes away. Like GNOME is what stays, right? And I think sort of like talking about like the general trajectory of the project over the last 15 years or so, the main thing that we've been sort of focused on is like fixing the app ecosystem and like actually creating an app ecosystem. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I think at the core of all of that is like the move from sort of distribution packages made by someone somewhere at some time schedule to developer like maintained Flatpaks on FlatHub, because like then you can sort of ship an app today and like have apps downloaded tonight. And you know it's going to work, and you know it's going to have all the dependencies and yada, yada, yada. I don't think I need to explain this too much in depth, but I think that's really unlocked like a whole series of things for the app ecosystem. We have libadwaita now, which is our like platform library that has all the custom, all the sort of default widgets. So like in the past, like if you wanted to make a list box, you needed to like do a bunch of custom stuff with like CSS or whatever to just like get the standard list. And now for that we have a widget, as we do for like whatever 100 other things. And libadwaita has been, I think, a huge sort of improvement in like making apps more consistent, making them easier to build, like improving the APIs to just like do all of the basic things that like you need to do to build an app. And I think we've really seen the benefits of that in the past years. We also have a new app icon style, or new, I guess it's 5 years old now, but it still feels new to me. We redid the app icon style a few years back, and I think that's also been a huge success because it's way easier to do icons now, and like we actually see app developers sometimes like get into it a little bit because they see like, oh, okay, this is actually like not that hard, and sometimes they make okay icons just on their own, but then like sort of as the designers, you can just in way less time than before help them and like give them like a good icon, and I think that's also improved things a lot. We have GNOME Circle now, which is basically like a verification/education program for third-party app developers, where basically we have a committee that you can submit your app to, and then you just like open a GitLab issue, and then basically we give them feedback. We have a checklist from everything from licensing to accessibility to like using the right design patterns, like whether dark mode works, whether like all of the things that you need to like have a really good app. And we also focus a lot on education as part of this process, where like it's not just sort of, we're not just trying to like fix this app, we're also trying to sort of train someone to become a really good GNOME developer. And currently we have around 65 apps in Circle, although it could probably be 80 if we were faster at reviews. And I need to get back to some reviews. So since I don't know like how many of you are like whatever following GNU Linux like desktop stuff, I thought I'd maybe include some examples of just like sort of apps that this process sort of has created in the broader sense. And I'll just very quickly go through them. There's a Wikipedia app called Wike. There's this very nice resources, like system resources monitor thing. Newsflash is a very nice RSS reader. There's Railway, which like uses the fact that like there's only one backend used by like most public transport companies, and you can kind of like just use that API, and it works for like Deutsche Bahn, but it also works for like all kinds of like local whatever public transport things. You can just like look for trains and stuff. There's like a fretboard for looking up guitar chords. Tuba as a Mastodon client. This very nice drum machine thing that I recently did the stock review for, and yeah, I don't know. I'm just very excited that like people are making like fun little things to like make music with and stuff. Fragments is a sort of non-awful torrent client, I would say. We have a podcast app. There's this thing which I really like, sort of like, there's a lot of like these small little tools for like, for example, web developers and stuff like that. And I think this is a great example. Just like the thing to like preview share cards for social media platforms, because otherwise you need to use some like awful website that whatever doesn't work half the time. Foliate's like ebook app. Apostrophe is a very nice Markdown app, and so on. Just like some examples in case people are not following this day to day. A few sort of like takeaways, successes, failures, and so on. I think a big success for us has been like having these easy points of entry. I think for designers, like having the app icons was a really good sort of thing to get people started, and then often like people start with that, and then they get into more stuff. And I think also third-party apps, like you start with a very simple like third-party app, and then eventually you end up maintaining, I don't know, like the font rendering stack or whatever. That's how it always works. Like sort of people start with something, and then they realize, oh, there's a much bigger thing here, and actually there's other important problems around it. I think since we're so self-organized, it's sometimes really good to have constraints. For example, like the freezes twice a year with a release, or also like if you have a grant, sort of then you like maybe you could have done this on volunteer time, but like also it's helpful to have sort of that the extra little bit of motivation of like a timeline. And then yeah, I think we've seen that like good design attracts more design-minded developers, not just designers, and that I think really helps because a lot of these people like they know our HIG maybe better than the designers, and they like fix sort of just smaller like HIG bugs across all the app ecosystem, and that's really cool. And yeah, I think developer tools like libadwaita I think has been an absolute game changer. Some challenges, I think in general planning has been difficult when we tried it. I think for a while we tried to like have sort of calls throughout the cycle to like see if we can like coordinate stuff better. But then in practice we noticed that like people either from their employer or like just on their own time, they already have their own agenda, and you're not really gonna influence that by like whatever having planning calls. Like sort of it's not really how it works unless you have resources behind it. I think scaling design reviews is something that we're still working on because there are like, I don't know, we get pinged on GitLab 1,000 times a day, and yeah, I think we need to figure out how to like get that working more smoothly so people don't have to wait for weeks for a response sometimes. I think there are some big initiatives where we have a plan, but like we've never gotten it off the ground because it's like a huge amount of technical sort of like low-level work to actually unblock that. For example, tiling. Yeah, I think we need to figure out something to, yeah, maybe just like do more funding work to get those kind of things off the ground. And then yeah, like another one that I personally want to do eventually is encourage more large apps, because I think we've seen a lot of small and medium-sized apps that are like very well designed and sort of like independently developed and so on, but we haven't seen like the next Inkscape or something, and that is something I would really like to see. So yeah, some learnings. I think focusing on the third-party ecosystem really pays off because it just grows the developer base. I think what we should also do as sort of a next step is like formalize the onboarding process more to like scale that better. For really important stuff, yeah, just do the work that's needed to find funding. And then yeah, maybe like there are problems with our developer story for large apps. Like, I don't know, but I think maybe we need to find a large app, we need to start a new large app and like see what that looks like. Maybe it's gonna improve the developer story as a result. But yeah, that's just like sort of some learnings, next steps for that. So does any of this apply outside of GNOME? I don't know. I'm hoping that's at least an interesting example. There are a bunch of unique factors, right? Like it's a huge community, and like there's so many different parts of it. The tech stack is kind of like an island because like we make all of our own stuff, and so like we're not super connected at that level with many other projects. There's like a level of continuity in design that I think is rare. There are designers like on the GNOME design team who've been doing this since the early 2000s, and yeah, have been employed full time for most of that. And so I think that is, I'm not sure how well that translates to other projects. And yeah, we have this very well-established design culture that, like in many other places, difficult to get to that level. But yeah, I'm hoping that at least like maybe on a strategic level, something we can try the next 8 years is instead of like trying to fix the apps where the design is really bad and like we don't really have a plan, maybe we look to the places where like sort of the design side is figured out and we like grow those. Like maybe instead of I don't know, like redesigning the current sort of LibreOffice code base, we build a new like LibreOffice front end in GTK using the rendering code. I don't know. Just an idea. Maybe that's not going to work out. Maybe like the real whatever solution is more organizing in those other projects, figuring out the culture. But yeah, that's sort of my strategic input. Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask about what sort of metrics you use to measure when something's successful. Like, is it?
We don't even have a channel to users. Like, we do research every once in a while, but that's it.
Okay.
Right. Like, I mean, we make a thing that is then used by Fedora to ship to people. So, like, there have been discussions about like doing some kind of metric system, but as of right now, nothing exists.
But like even like user feedback or anything like that from like the community? Or
oh, sure, yeah.
Okay, so that's basically, okay, cool. Thank you.
Actually, that's a really good question. And it does open up actually, I think, a wider discussion that would be interesting to have. Just before I ask the question, I will say that I'm very disorganized personally, even though I think I'm pretty organized as a designer. I didn't actually know that someone from the GNOME project was going to be speaking, so I didn't just put that in my presentation because I knew you were coming up next. Like a really good resource for knowing whether a design is working or not is, you know, the dirty word telemetry, right? Which is just getting feedback about what is clicked on, what isn't clicked on, is something actually being used or not. And there are a couple of ways you can do that are like open to the public, that are not let's say going to attract lots of criticism, but it is kind of a bit of a dirty word, you know, phoning home and asking people to opt in to to having what they're doing tracked, even though in reality what comes back is usually just like 30% of users who opened the app clicked on this, 60% of users clicked on that. It's you could publish it openly, for example. I think is one way you could make it really transparent. But I'm wondering, have you had that discussion? Is like telemetry like a dirty word for your project as well?
I mean, I think it is an active discussion. Like, there are a few people who want to do it. I know Endless has some kind of system like this downstream, and they kind of want to upstream it. Personally, I'm not sure, because I find that like there are not that many cases where I'm like, oh, this is where some data like across all of our users would really help. I think often what would help more is like more qualitative research, but then also backed up by resources to address the issues, because we have like done research exercises where like we still have findings sort of on the table from like years ago that we just don't have the resources to implement. So I think there are definitely questions sort of on a day-to-day basis where that would help, but like to me that's not like an urgent issue.
Yeah, I mean I think user testing, getting feedback, that stuff is absolutely crucial. For me, like telemetry is just more like identifying where there's smoke. And then once you see that something's not being used at all, you implemented some new system and you suddenly see a drop in usage, for example, or like session times reduce. There's some instances where it can tell you, oh, there might be a problem here, and from that then you can dig a little bit further. But anyway, thanks for answering the question, and really nice presentation as well.
Thanks.
With design, with UI kits in various programming languages, there are often two different ways of creating an interface. Either you have a reactive type structure, where you call functions in code and you nest those functions, or you use something like GTK Builder, where you're using an XML file. Do designers tend to have a preference to one or the other, or is designer versus developer not a factor that comes into that preference?
I mean, generally, like as the design team, like this is the kind of decision that like we don't take, right? In the sort of like spirit of deferring to the expert. Like, if the app developer like works best, I don't know, like doing things without a UI file, I'm fine with that because I don't actually maintain the UI files. Like, I sort of occasionally make changes to like minor things, but I think mostly that's not our domain.
Okay, hello. Disclosure, I'm from Canonical, so from one of the downstreams. We often talk about like quality when it comes to delivering a desktop to clients. So I just wanted to know what's your internal perspective in the design team about like not just like providing tools for people to improve the quality, but also monitoring what gets out to users.
I mean, like it's sort of tricky for us because generally, like, there are things that we can test easily, right? Like anything that builds in Flatpak, no problem. Open it in Builder, like test it today. Anything that's like deeper in the system, sometimes you need to wait until like there's a distro that actually ships it. Usually that's like Fedora Rawhide, like whatever, the week after the 0.0. And then like the options you have for changing stuff are very limited because like you're even past sort of the beta, whatever, freezes and so on. Like you can't really change strings anymore. You can't really change UI, and so like it really depends on where in the stack that is. For example, right now like we have a thing with notifications that like we landed whatever 3 months ago, that like so like the feature is basically grouping notifications like visually in like a stack sort of by app. And that's the kind of thing that you really want to test on your real system. I can test in a VM, but like that I don't get any notifications in the VM. And so like I think ultimately long term what we need is like GNOME OS to become a thing that you can run day to day, because then you can actually sort of like get those like day-to-day quality issues, sort of catch them way earlier. But until then, I think, yeah, a lot of the stuff is going to have to be figured out basically in the distro integration process, which is very far from ideal, but it is what it is at the moment.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Can we get another round of applause for all of our speakers today?